So it looks like most people are out of the waiting room now. So I think we can go ahead and get started. And as more people filter in, we will let them in. But hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this afternoon. My name is Andrew Shannon. I'm going to be moderating today. And I'm a first-year PhD student here at NC State University within the Center for Geospatial Analytics. And along with my fellows and my co-hosts of this event, who you might note on the slideshow you're seeing right now, we represent the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. And the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center is a part of a national network of CASCs across the country with the goal of working with natural and cultural resource managers, and as well as a variety of other partners to pursue research and build tools and co-produce knowledge for the stewardship of ecosystems and for community planning efforts in the face of a changing climate and to anticipate the impacts of a changing climate. And the Southeast CASC is naturally focused on questions that pertain to the Southeast. This is the 10th anniversary of the Global Change Fellows Program, and each year since the initiation of the Global Change Fellows Program, the CASC has taken on a small cohort of interdisciplinary students whose research is pursuing issues related to climate. And each year, our group comes together to produce a series of informational seminars to help engage not only students and faculty at the university, but with the wider network of CASC partners and people with whom the center engages. And this seminar today on the freshwater futures of the southeastern United States is going to be the last of our seminars of the 2021-2022 academic calendar. So thank you all for joining today. I think this is going to be a great conversation, and I will be introducing our panelists and speakers momentarily. I will say that if you didn't get a chance to participate in our previous seminars, which covered a range of topics related to how we frame climate change discussions, related to storytelling in climate change, and also reviewing some of the most recent information from the IPCC reports, I suggest you check out the Southeast CASC website or YouTube page where you can find recordings of those seminars. And before we get started with the conversation today, we want to take a quick poll of the audience members just to get a sense of who you are and how you might have heard of this event today so that we can continue to improve how we engage audiences in future events. So it looks like many of you are filling out the poll, which is fantastic. So if you will take a moment to let us know your affiliation, that is greatly appreciated. So we'll leave that open for a few more seconds. Great, and it seems like we're getting a lot of people from the university, as well as some representation from different agencies, NGO work. And it seems like many people heard about this from the CASC newsletter, so that's wonderful information to have. Thank you for participating in that. So with all that said, we can now get into today's event. So today we are building off of the first part of this seminar series. Yesterday, we had a screening of the film Hidden Rivers, which is a documentary into freshwater ecosystems of the Southern Appalachians. And I see some familiar names in our participant list from people who participated in the screening yesterday. So hopefully you were inspired and are ready with questions to ask our panel of speakers today. We've brought together 3 researchers and managers from throughout the region who are tackling many of the questions brought up in that film related to the stewardship of these ecosystems. So I'll briefly introduce our speakers, starting with Andy Dolloff, who is a fishery ecologist and project leader with the USDA Forest Service Southern Research Station, Forested Watershed Science Research Unit, and is a professor of fishery science within the Department of Fish and Wildlife Conservation at Virginia Tech. He's also a principal science advisor to the Center for Aquatic Technology Transfer, which is a research and management partnership. He hails from Maine and holds educational experience from the University of Maine, North Carolina State University, as well as Montana State University in Bozeman. He has a range of research interests, but in addition to his personal research, Andy oversees forest research programs on 3 U.S. Forest Service experimental forests, the Coweta, Santee, and Cipolla in North and South Carolina, as well as Florida. We also have Todd Ewing, who served as the Aquatic Wildlife Diversity Program Manager and Assistant Chief of Fisheries for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, a position that he held for 14 years. And in that role, he oversaw conservation of non-game fishes, crayfishes, and freshwater mussels in North Carolina. Since his retirement from the Wildlife Resources Commission last week, Todd now serves as the coordinator for the Southeast Aquatic Resources Partnership, also known as SARP or SARP. And in his new role, Todd will oversee landscape scale conservation in aquatic systems throughout the southeastern United States. And lastly, we have Caleb Hickman, who is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, a certified wildlife biologist, and the supervisory fish and wildlife biologist for the Office of Fisheries and Wildlife Management for the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. I will also note that Dr. Hickman served as the 2021 Barkalow Distinguished Conservationist Lecturer here at the College of Natural Resources this past fall. So we're very lucky to have him back for our conversation today. With all that said, I'm going to turn it over now to our speakers. And after that, we'll get the ball rolling with some questions that our group of fellows have prepared, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, we encourage you to use the chat box to ask your questions, and then to keep it conversational in nature, I'll call on you to unmute yourself and ask the question from there. So getting started, we can go one by one with our speakers, and I'll ask you to just elaborate a bit more on what you would like to share about your background, who you are, and more specifically, what your research or stewardship or management system is, whatever focus you might have on specific species or what parts of the ecosystem stewardship you address in your work. And also, as a component of that, if you could please touch on what motivates you to work in these systems and in this line of work. So I'll turn it over to the 3 of you, whoever would like to begin.
Osio Nagad, Caleb Hickman, Dawado, Jijaleg, Ayeli. I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss some of my interests, and for you guys, I really appreciate the CASC for inviting me. And just to elaborate a little bit, background-wise, I've been in the world of ecology for almost 20 years now. So variety of capacities. We work with a variety of game and non-game fish and wildlife. In the aquatic realm, we work mainly in the intersection of research and management in an area called adaptive research, but in a socio-ecological framework. And what that really means is we take information that we're gathering as we're managing, and we try to learn from it. And we provide that information to decision makers and the community that we work for. I work for the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. So a lot of this information may be tied to the resources in the aquatic system that are particularly beneficial to the economy or to the culture. So tourism is incredibly important in our area. So those are particular areas that we focus on. And it could be applied work, and it could be work that the public visiting would find interesting or helpful in some way as well. So yes, we work to protect, preserve cultural resources and biodiversity. Those are our main interests. And our main threats in our area are barriers to connectivity, like dams, culverts, habitat degradation. We do have pretty strong regulatory actions because the tribe is a sovereign nation. Because of that, we're on trust landscapes, so it's a bit different. We are separate from the state of North Carolina, but we do work very closely with the state of North Carolina and our federal partners, like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, and we work together on some of these shared issues. We try to restore species. We monitor species. We look at habitat and environmental quality, riparian buffer issues, siltation, and of course, climate change. I think that's about. I'd love to talk about some of our more specific projects, but that's really sort of a broad. We work with a variety of species, so it gets really broad. You know, we up to 40 different species in the aquatic environments. So that's sort of hopefully a short review of what we do.
I can go next, Andy, if you want me to. Yeah, really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak. I have a soft place in my heart for NC State. I have a daughter that just graduated this past year with a fish and wildlife degree from NC State, and two more kids in the different CNR programs at State. So go back. A little bit about me. Bachelor's degree in biology from UNC Charlotte back in the day. Went on to get my master's degree in biology at Appalachian State University. Then started to work with the Wildlife Commission as a fisheries biologist, mainly doing various types of habitat work through the years. Then in 2008, became the supervisor of our aquatic wildlife diversity program. And as Andrew said during the introduction, that program is responsible for managing non-game fish, mussels, and crayfish all across North Carolina. And I did that up until last week, actually. Last Friday was my last day with the Wildlife Commission. And so for about a week now, I have been the coordinator of the Southeast Aquatic Resources Partnership. And in that role, I'm going to focus. I would like to say I focus, but I'm too new to say I'm focused on anything yet. But we focus on this landscape scale aquatic conservation. We cover 15 states in the Southeast, all the way from Texas and Oklahoma over to Virginia, Florida. And the things we work on are some of the same things that Caleb mentioned. A lot of habitat stuff like barrier removal, trying to facilitate dam removals, habitat restoration, and that sort of thing. And, you know, as far as why I like doing this sort of thing, you know, it's something we all enjoy doing as kids, playing in streams, going out and finding things. And now I get to do it as an adult, only to get paid for it.
Okay, I guess it's my turn. Andy Dolloff, grew up in Maine, did a degree at University of Maine, did my time in Raleigh, 75 to 79, went from there to Bozeman, Montana, and then spent summers in Southeast Alaska. I'm one of those rare kids, well, not anymore, but was one of those rare kids who knew sort of from the get-go what I wanted to do. Not specifically, I didn't know I'd wind up in the Southeast working on, you know, freshwater fish communities, but I grew up in a coastal town where there was at the time a Bureau of Commercial Fisheries laboratory. It's now become the National Marine Fisheries Service. And my father was a maintenance man at that lab. And I spent a lot of my formative years from age 4 or 5 on up, going over there, putting my hands in tanks that they had no business being in, and learning about it and just falling in love with marine and aquatic organisms in general. So I was really fortunate to be able to spend time in 3 different parts of the country. I always say I'm from the southern Maine, southeastern US, southwest Montana, and southeast Alaska. And once I did my dissertation work in Alaska, did a postdoc in Alaska, thought I would be there till I died in Alaska. I was in a postdoc. I really needed a permanent job. One came open in Blacksburg, Virginia. And I thought, well, back to the Southeast, 5 years back to Alaska. And 30 plus years later, I'm still in the Appalachians. Why? Well, over my shoulder is one of the good reasons why. If you think about a place like Alaska, lots and lots of fish, but not that many species. So a very speciose small stream community in Southeast Alaska might have as many as 5 species, but whereas here in Southwest Virginia, and of course in parts of North Carolina, you might have as many as 15 or 16 or 30 or 40 species in a stream. Where I live is like 2 miles from the Eastern Continental Divide. Streams to where headed to where I am right now drain to the Gulf via the New River, the Monongahela, the Ohio and Mississippi. Where I live, if I walk to the top of the mountain down the other side, those streams drain to the James River and to the Chesapeake Bay. Entirely different fish communities. Talk about complexity. It's really an exciting place. Plus, there is the fact that if you live in a place like Alaska, every person on the street corner is a fish biologist. So you wind up being a relatively small fish, no pun intended, actually it was a pun intended, in a pretty big pond. But here in the Southeast, there just aren't that many aquatic biologists, fish biologists. It seems like there might be a lot when you participate in seminars like this, but my playground, if you will, right now is basically from Virginia to Puerto Rico over to Texas, basically the 13 southern states plus the territory of Puerto Rico. And oh, by the way, I get a chance to go up to Alaska and follow up on some of my my earlier research. So it's a pretty good gig. It's a pretty good job, and it's working with critters that I really love. The unfortunate part of all of this is that as I've gone on in my career, I've taken on more and more responsibilities for administration. So I'm now the project leader for Forest Watershed Science, and that's everything from soils to hydrology to fish biology to wildlife biology to silviculture to atmospheric chemistry to water. It's the whole ball of wax, and it's pretty exciting. But I really just get to look at proposals that people submit to me and pass judgment on them, tweak it here, tweak it there. But I get to dabble in a whole lot of different things. And one of the big things that really is of major interest is water from the national forests, but not only from the national forest, but from the upland areas in the South. There are a number of publications that the Forest Service has put out recently, water from our national forests in the Southeast. That has since been expanded because it was received so well to the whole country. So we're involved with a whole lot of different things. Some of you are familiar with Coweta. It's the second oldest, longest running experimental forest in the National Forest System. The only older one is the Fraser in Colorado, but we have water quality and streamflow records going back to the 1920s. Pretty cool stuff. And those data are publicly available for people who want to do really interesting things with it. So rather than go too much further down in the weeds, I'd simply just like to say that my personal research interest, I always, even though all the colorful fish are in the background there, I've always loved salmonids and in particular brook trout. And I'm really interested in the factors that influence the production. And I don't mean just the numbers of fish, but the actual production of brook trout and other cold water species. As a matter of fact, one of my most recent master's students is a cohort of yours, Bonnie Myers, did a master's with me on the production of brook trout. And she's now at NC State working on a PhD. I think she's currently in Germany. But I have a long history of working on brook trout, primarily vicariously through my students and whatnot, but that's a passion. Also very interested in best management practices. I think Caleb mentioned aquatic organism passage. We've got a big program in that. And Todd, if you don't know it already, we're a big contributor to the SARP database on aquatic organism passage, the group that I work with. Other folks doing some work in our group are looking at restoration of things like longleaf pine wet savannas in the Southeast. We're working with fire and the effects of prescribed fire on riparian areas and in-stream water quality, those kinds of things. So again, I think I'll stop there because unfortunately for you, I could probably go on and on, but I don't think that that's in the best interest right now. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you to the three of you for elaborating a bit more on who you are and your work. And for those people in the audience who joined in the past few minutes, welcome. We're going to get into some of the questions that our group of fellows have prepared, but for the audience members, please start putting any questions you have in the chat so that we can get some participation from you all as well. So jumping off of something you all have mentioned in one way or another, the idea of thinking about habitat restoration, connectivity in these systems, issues related to dam removal. One of the things we were interested as a group is what you anticipate in terms of future impacts, not only from these, I guess, land cover and sort of infrastructure related components, but also in terms of climate. What are some of the impacts you might have already observed in these systems? And what do you anticipate the impacts of climate to be on the systems that you study in the coming decades? And again, I'll leave it open for whoever wants to get the ball rolling with that question.
It's kind of like playing poker, I think. Who's going to go first? Or, I'll take a stab at it first, because ours may be a little bit different. One question that we've sort of been talking about, and I hope to work with some of the folks there, and other people as well, is our indirect effects. And I think there's a climate science, climate change research often centers on direct effects. And I think what we may have in our area, if it ends up being a climate refuge for a while, is a human dimension that we're not always considering. And where we're at, in the mountains, we see a lot of people move here. And we're already seeing that. People that are having issues in Florida, so the retirees, and the Florida license plates are growing. And they want another house here. So that can cause impacts socially and economically to our area. And that's a consideration that we need to have. And also more building on top of mountains because of this. A lot of people want to live on top of the mountain. And this can cause impacts to some of our watersheds as well. And these indirect effects of climate change in another place. So in Florida, sea level rise, more hurricanes, what other impacts in places outside of here, and people want to move to this refuge, and it could cause problems here. So we need to start thinking about what we're going to do about that, if there is anything we can do about it, or at least be prepared for this in some way. And those are the considerations that I'm usually bringing up lately anyway, because I think a lot of the other ones are in front of us. A lot of people are talking about them. And they sometimes go along with other impacts. Human disturbance of riparian areas are really important. Introduced species are really important to notice. These are all factors I think we need to consider, but the one a lot of people don't consider, these indirect effects, the indirect impacts. And I thought I'd start with that one because it's a little out there, but you can circle back.
One of the issues we have with climate change is, unlike most threats, we think we can figure out how to stop it. Well, in the fisheries world, there's not a lot we can do to stop climate change. That's somebody else's issue somewhat. So the question is how do we manage it? And, we have some tools, we think, but by and large, we don't have a good answer to that. Things like protecting riparian zones so that we prevent some of the, or at least offset some of the flashiness, helps absorb some of that runoff, or removing barriers so that as water temperatures warm, fish may be able to move into different parts of the watershed. But as a resource manager, really just getting a handle on what we can do to offset climate change is really one of our biggest unanswered questions. And, you know, to that, we're going to look to the universities and the Climate Adaptation Science Center and folks like that to give us answers, to figure out what we can do, because as resource managers, we really implement ideas that other people smarter than us come up with. And right now, you know, we don't have a lot of those. And you know, to me, going forward, we really need to get a good handle on what we can do. We're going to continue to implement the things that we know work, like I said, riparian zones, removing barriers. But you know what, we're seeing die-offs of mussels in some of our southeastern rivers. Y'all are familiar with some of the stuff up in Virginia. We're also seeing them in North Carolina. The Little Tennessee River had a die-off of Appalachian elk toe. Used to be one of our strongest streams for that species. You know, we don't know what caused that. I see Jay Levine's on this. He's been researching that for the Wildlife Commission for years. We still don't have a good answer. You know, is it related to climate change? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. So as a resource manager, we're trying to do the things we know, but like I said, we really have to get a handle on what other things we can do and try to add a few more arrows to our quiver so we can try to manage climate change.
Thank you. Annie, do you have any thoughts you'd like to
Yeah, I
contribute
just
in
that,
that
that last statement, managing climate change. That's wow. That's I hope that we can. I think it's actually managing us, unfortunately. And what can we do about climate change? Well, I can think of a couple of things that hopefully will be useful. Caleb mentioned the human factor in there, and that if I were to pick one thing, it would be the human factor, the one that we have the least control over, yet can likely have the biggest impact, all the way from climate change to building in the urban wildland interface, not only from the standpoint of pure habitat for aquatic terrestrial species and whatnot, but also for managing things like wildfire. Wildfire is a huge threat, not only in the Western United States, but a couple of years ago, we almost lost Gatlinburg, Tennessee to wildfire. And that kind of thing that can happen again. It will happen again. It's just a question of when and when the conditions are right. We all remember what happened in Boulder, Colorado last fall. Well, it was not that different from what actually happened in Gatlinburg. So these are all things that are brewing. But from an aquatic standpoint, we've done some work that I can touch on briefly. We've got a long-term data set on stream and air temperature, stream water and air temperature, going from basically the cold water region from North Georgia, North Alabama, all the way up through to Maryland. It's based on the Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture database of cold water streams. And one of the things we wanted to do beginning in 2010 was to try to get a handle on the temperature profile of these putative cold water streams that go in the southern half of the range of the brook trout, thinking that we'd be able to then document over time the change as those streams gradually warm. Well, guess what? By 2012, those streams, a sample of those streams that we thought originally were going to be all cold water, fully a third of them were either cool water or actually warm water. And that was demonstrated both in the temperature profile and in the fish community. So you would expect to see brook trout and dace and sculpin and typical cold water species. Well, in many cases, you might have 10 or 12 species of fish, only one of which might be trout. And it wouldn't even be brook trout, it'd be an introduced trout like brown trout or rainbow trout. So rather than documenting the onset of climate change effects in cold water, we caught it in progress. And that's not necessarily good news. Now, there is good news buried within that, because some of the streams actually turn out to be pretty well buffered for temperature, meaning that they have a groundwater signal. So one of the uses of these data could be to go out and say, well, we can't stop climate change. We can't stop some of these streams from warming. But if we were to be able to do things like acquisition of land to protect or to institute, I think Todd mentioned riparian zones, significant riparian zones. Well, you can't do that everywhere, but this would give us a way to sort of go through and parse and say, these are the ones that we really need to protect for these particular reasons. It wouldn't just be cold water, but there are other attributes that go along with being a cold water stream. So there are things that we can do rather than just simply get out of the way. I think that there are things that we could put in place that would enable us to tackle some of these. There is a real big role for agencies and for science, because the science I described to you is really in its infancy. It was undertaken largely because right up until that point, we were relying on the downloaded GCMs for air temperature and assuming there was a correlation with air temperature and water temperature. And if you get so many degrees rise in air temperature, water temperature is going to follow across the board. We know that's not true, because in some cases you get a very tight fit, a great correlation, 0.99. But in other cases, air temperature goes up with water temperature until you get to 15 degrees. Water temperature flatlines, that's a groundwater signature. Air temperature can do whatever it wants. Water temperature is not going to go up. That's one you want to pay attention to for a whole lot of reasons. So again, I think I'll stop there, but this is great. I love the provocative nature of the questions that are being asked.
I love that you brought up fire, because that is a traditional method too, and we really want to bring that back, especially in areas where disturbance has been taken out of the equation. So humans are part of the system, whether we like it or not. But we also need to remember humans have been part of the system for thousands of years, and so let's leverage what folks have learned. But look forward to some of the other issues. And I really appreciate that, Andy, that you brought that up, because it's often an area that people sort of, they think fire is this dangerous thing that we need to be careful with. But we've just had fires this last couple of weeks here. And it is kind of scary, that, and it can affect our aquatic ecosystems. So we need to be careful with that. So the terrestrial landscape is definitely tied to our aquatic environments, and that's something to remember. We have these storms that are becoming more chaotic, and droughts too. That's another factor in our ecosystems, and I think those are important to recognize that go along with the fire. That we'll have to figure out novel ways of managing this, and yeah, like I think Todd says, we are just trying to figure out how to live with this change. And I think it's a good point. I appreciate that.
Thank you. And I think we do have a question from one of our audience members, Jennifer Cartwright. So Jennifer, we've touched on this subject. So please, would you like to unmute yourself and pose this question? Because I think it relates quite directly to what we've been talking about so far.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So I asked both the combination of climate models that are projecting stronger storm peaks and stream flow, plus increases in impervious surface, so flashier streams in urbanizing watersheds. Both of those together suggest potential hydraulic and geomorphic changes, right? So how do you see those playing out? And can you comment on sediment and siltation effects on aquatic habitats, how that may change in the coming decades?
Well, hellbenders were brought up earlier. That species we think are and other species like them and mussel species, they're all impacted by the sediment. So bringing that into the play, I mean, we already see that. So if this becomes, we have more problems with the flashy nature of the storms and more sediment load, I expect that to be a major problem. And I don't know how to mitigate that other than manual removal of sediment. we're, maybe my colleagues here have more input, but I think hellbenders, the organisms that need rock underneath, need access underneath rocks to breed, they're going to be hit by this, and that's kind of scary to me.
Yeah, we're seeing exactly what you mentioned. Caleb, you mentioned mussels. My last few years at the Wildlife Commission, we've seen a lot of storms. We've had several 100-year storms just in the last couple of years. And because of that, we're having a lot more trouble finding mussels in a lot of the streams than we used to find them, whether they're being buried or dislodged, moved downstream, whatever. We're seeing it right now. And we think this is probably a permanent solution. It's the new, or a permanent situation. It's the new normal. As far as what it means long term, we don't know. Maybe the systems will adapt, come to a new equilibrium. We don't know yet, but we are definitely seeing the climate related issues affecting us right now. This is not something that's going to happen 20 years from now. It's happening now.
Wow, where to begin? Sediment has been and will continue to be one of the major issues that affects not just cold water streams, but basically any stream from the first break in slope from a headwater stream all the way down to the receiving waters of the ocean, if you will. A lot of the sediment that's currently in some of our major rivers, the Yadkin and a number of others in North Carolina, a lot of that sediment originated up on the ridge tops 100 or plus years ago, and it's on its way until it gets trapped behind a dam somewhere to the ocean. We're going to be living with that legacy for a long time. This creates a real problem for people who would like to say we need to set up a baseline for sedimentation impacts, and we can work from that baseline for development. Well, that baseline, as long as you understand what you're doing, you're setting up a baseline for conditions that were set in motion 50 or 100 years ago. That's not what would be there in the absence of human activities in the last 100 years. Caleb mentioned that for 10,000, maybe more years, there were people on the landscape that were, millions of people, literally, that were living and using the assets, using the forests, using the streams, harvesting fish and wildlife, doing all those things. But by and large, they were not impacting the integrity of entire watersheds the way that we have done. We, meaning, white Europeans, if you want to call us that, basically, particularly since post-Civil War era, when we would go in and slick off entire watersheds. And sometimes they'd go back, but more often than not, they became mountain farms. That's mountain farms of both folklore and reality. Western North Carolina, Eastern Kentucky, Southwestern Virginia. You can see pictures of corn growing to the ridgetop. Most of those extremely deep, rich soils, up to 1 meter deep in some of the coves, particularly in Western North Carolina, wound up down in the creeks, and it's long gone. And what you see now are very thin old horizons in a lot of these soils. Why? Because it's all been washed downstream, and it's existing in some of our stream channels. And we can do a lot through things like best management practices if we want to go back in and work in those watersheds by maintaining the integrity of streamside management zones that may include a buffer zone wherein you would not have any activities that might disturb soil. One thing that we know for sure, the products of a watershed are water and sediment. It's always going to be coming down. The job that we have is try to make sure that we don't get too much sediment or too much water at one time. What kinds of things can we do to prevent that? Well, one of the areas that I've had a lot of interest in and a lot of work in is in large wood in streams. I started doing that work in Alaska, came to the Southeast and continued some of that. And the difference here between here and the Southeast Alaska is orders of magnitude, the amount of wood. So given the stream flows that you have up there, you would expect to see a lot more sediment movement. Well, except where you have major timber harvest, you don't see all that much. I mean, occasionally you do when you get a landslide, but by and large, all of that structure in the stream, all of that downed wood slows the transport of water. And it's the velocity of water and the quantity of water that dislodges sediment and becomes, dislodges soil, becomes sediment, and that's what causes the problem. So what can we do? Well, we can manage for including structure back in our streams. We can manage to have stream crossings that are hardened to prevent excess sediment from coming in at stream crossings. We can do things like, it's pretty well established that hardwood forest generates a more even stream flow and keeps more water on the land than does pine. And so depending on if you cut an area, if you want to reforest it back into, you can manage the amount of water coming off. I think I got that backwards actually. You can manage the amount of water coming off of a watershed just by the species that you put back there and the time that you allow those species to remain on the landscape. So there's a lot of things that we can do, but we also have to be able to think, what does a healthy stream look like? A healthy stream is a messy stream. And by messy, I mean, it's got a lot of stuff in it, a lot of wood, not car bodies and washing machines, but actual wood. So, you know, I had a call just the other day, yesterday, in fact, from Florida. Hurricane Michael laid over a whole bunch of trees into the coastal plain stream. And there's a big concern. Oh, the sandbed stream is going to destabilize. Probably not. And the worst thing that we could do is take some of this money that was passed in the most recent budget, getting down a little bit in the weeds here, and try to salvage that timber and to manage the stream. The stream doesn't need our help. It will manage itself. I think the best thing we could do in many of those situations is nothing. Leave it alone. Because the wood that's there now may look like, and it is different than it was prior to Hurricane Michael, but it's only because prior to then we were mucking about and we were harvesting trees down there. We were doing our best to get the stuff out of the water, which is probably, in terms of stability and in terms of fish habitat and in terms of delivery of water and sediment, the worst thing we could have done. Sorry, you hit a soapbox.
Thank you for sharing. And I think we have a question in the chat that centers around a lot of what the three of you have mentioned in terms of thinking about responses to some of these issues, particularly sedimentation or some of the other current or future anticipated impacts to these systems. So Tyler Thurston, if you want to unmute yourself and pose your question or other thoughts you might have in response to what has just been said, please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm a university student and my professor has been recently talking about climate changes in the past 100 years and some of the effects, but I was wondering if you could go into further depth what some of the effects might be today and also some methods that you might be using to approach the climate change or even adapt to said changes.
And out of personal interest, I'm going to add on hopefully a related question is if there's anything you can mention about the decision making practice to get to those actions or those responses.
Okay. The last 100 years for climate change, that's an interesting question. And I would have to say that with with the rise in like things like coal production and coal-fired plants and industrialization, one of the things that's led to sort of larger scale, maybe not global, well, actually global too, climate change was the phenomenon of acid rain. And up until the passage of the Clean Air Act and the amendments to the Clean Air Act in the 90s or so, we were seeing an ever stronger acidification signal into particularly our eastern headwater watersheds from Maine all the way down through Virginia into North Carolina, such that fish populations in particular were really put in jeopardy. Many of them were extirpated because of acid rain and acid rain spates. The Clean Air Act came in, and we're actually seeing a stabilization and an increase in improvement in the acid signal, both in rainfall and in watersheds. Now, there's a problem because some of our watersheds are naturally depauperate in buffering agents. The only buffering agent, calcium, for example, that comes into many Shenandoah National Park watersheds, comes in as dry deposition, better known as dust. So that's the only real acid neutralizing available cation in some of those watersheds comes in as dust, which sounds pretty dire. But I think given time and given the ability, a lot of these watersheds can recover from that. We can, in the short run, do things like lime to recover them. And again, this is for a relatively small subset of those streams. We actually had a published paper a few years ago that talked about the habitat squeeze. Back when acid rain was still an issue, we were able to document that fish were being driven downstream by acid precipitation from above. So brook trout, the only way they can go is either upstream or downstream to escape inhospitable conditions. We can't go upstream because the pH and the acid neutralizing capacity is too low. At the same time, with a warming signal from climate, we're seeing brook trout confined to a smaller area. So they get squeezed in between by acid from above, by warming temperatures from below. Not necessarily a good thing. Matter of fact, not a good thing at all. So there is a detectable ongoing signal that has its origins back sometime early in the previous century. So I'm hoping that gets to the kind of thing you were asking about, Tyler.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I think the only thing we've already touched on this, but it may apply to what Tyler's saying as well as the land effects. And there is a legacy effect of the land management, and whether it's the high grading, the forest assemblage now is so different, and also the let alone management strategies that a lot of folks, some federal agencies apply, may limit our ability to manage this. And we might need to switch what we do and how we do it on our landscape. We might need more fire, and we're realizing this now. I mean, it was brought up that the Gatlinburg fires were a wake-up call, but there's a lot of other, and this has already been brought up. We might need to look at a different management practice on the forest, but also our headwaters, protect them a little better. There's a lot of impacts that can hit us pretty hard with these droughts that they're accumulating. But there's also a history. There's a legacy effect from the way management has been done historically. We might need to change things, and I think that could be something we could do, and look at alternative ways of something else that we're kind of toying with is riparian buffers. We might need to. There's a lot of effort right now to work with private landowners to make sure they're not cutting right up against the river. And so there's a lot of conservation easements out there, a lot of conservation work, but there needs to be huge campaigns so that we work with the public and private landowners on these issues as well, and maybe look into other methods. So right now, riparian management, people that do it use a variety of species. They just grow faster, that are easier to grow. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're better. So there needs to be, I believe, a body of research around this. Things like, traditional plants like river cane. Is there a benefit to this species? And can we start putting that in our management plan and make that, if they are beneficial? They were once here, we'd see it everywhere. And we know it changes nutrient dynamics in the water as well. So there could be benefits to some of these species. A little more difficult to seed into our riparian areas, but I guess my point is we need to start rethinking how we manage and think about these legacy effects and how we can balance that along with these dramatic changes that are going to happen to our system.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add, you mentioned looking back 100 years. One of the problems we have, and Andy actually touched on this a little bit ago, is looking back that far, we actually don't know what our streams should look like. Andy mentioned the physical habitat, but we don't even know what the biological structure of a lot of our streams are. You know, a good example is the French Broad River out in the western part of the state. Where it enters North Carolina, there happens to be a break in ecoregions from Ridge and Valley to Blue Ridge, and a lot of our fish stop there. And for years, the conventional wisdom was, well, it's just a break in ecoregions. Well, we're thinking now that a lot of those fish that stop at the state line probably actually should have been in North Carolina. And one of the biologists out in the western part of the state, Luke Etchison's been doing a lot of historical research and discovering that, you know, a lot of the fish that we thought weren't there because of the different ecoregion actually aren't there because of probably one of the land uses that we did that Andy mentioned that probably extirpated the species from the state. And then because of a dam, couldn't get back in North Carolina. So it's really hard to look back and say what our streams should look like and see how they've changed over 100 years because we don't know what they should look like. We see, you know, we started really documenting our biota 40, 50, 60 years ago really well. Before that, you know, we've got some snapshots, but we don't know. So it's really hard to look back 100 years and then try to project forward what things should look like. It's going to take a lot more work and a lot more research before we can even get there.
Thank you. We do have believe it or not, we're actually running up into our last couple of minutes of this hour. And I think just goes to show how much there is to speak on this topic. We do have a question specific about engineered wetlands from Barbara. Barbara, would you like to pose your question to the group?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'm from Florida, recent transplant from Michigan, so know a lot about wetlands, very interested. Are engineered wetlands or wetland mitigation part of your management plans? And if so, are they effective?
That's a good question. You know, obviously urbanization is one of our big problems, at least here in the Piedmont, as well as other places. And we do think engineered wetlands will help in some of these urban streams. A good example of that, Charlotte Mecklenburg Utilities has done a pretty decent job restoring a lot of their streams, whether through stream restorations or requiring some sort of flow management stuff like a wetland catch basin type thing. And, you know, you can't say that they have pristine streams by any stretch, but if you look at what they have now compared to what they had, you know, as late as the 1990s, there's been a marked improvement. And that comes at a cost. Charlotte in particular has an impervious surface tax that they use to implement stuff like that. And it can work well in a fairly wealthy area. In a lot of places, the state, though, I don't know if you'd be able to get something like that. But, you know, just from my limited experience in some areas, they do work when you can get them, but it would be an expensive fix.
So you have a couple more questions coming into the chat. And I think this has been a great conversation centered on I think specific ideas to address some of those disturbance and climate related impacts that you described at the beginning of this conversation. I think just to keep us within the hour framework, I want to ask hopefully a question that can maybe address some of topics people are still bringing up in the chat, but also just give an opportunity for our three speakers. For those who have to hop out in just a few minutes, what would be a takeaway message you have for the audience based on this conversation and what we've covered here today? And which is a big question, or if there's anything else you want to comment on in our last couple of minutes in regards to the topics we've covered.
You know, I'll actually do a little bit of a takeaway, and it goes back to a question I believe you asked that maybe we didn't answer, but about the decision-making process. A takeaway would be these sound like insurmountable problems, and they are tough. But I found in my previous role and in my current role, there are a lot of people and a lot of good organizations working on trying to handle these issues. And we can't do anything in a vacuum. A lot of groups need to be brought into play. The public, in this case, the organizations that the two other panelists work with. We've worked successfully with both their organizations and done a lot of good work. But it takes consensus from a lot of different groups to be able to get things done. And if you do bring all those, I hate using this word synergy, it's so 1990s or early 2000s, but by bringing those folks into play, or those other people into play, you can start solving some of these issues. There's a question in the chat about restocking species. The Forest Service and the Wildlife Commission and several other organizations have helped restore spot fin chub in the Chua River. It's been a great management success, below an old bypass reach. The Wildlife Commission, Eastern Band of Cherokees, and others have successfully restored sickle fin red horse in the western part of the state. Those are all success stories because of partnerships and decisions that get made by a lot of different groups and a lot of stakeholders. So even though this is a large problem, it's not an insurmountable problem. And by bringing lots of interested folks and capable folks together, we can start to tackle some of these problems.
Yeah, there are so many tools that can be brought to bear on this issue. As I think Todd was talking about in his previous bit there, the whole notion of restoration, and there are things like beaver dams. Reintroducing beavers on the landscape can have a fairly significant impact, not only on streams and stream habitat, fish populations, but also they can serve to maintain a certain amount of and recycle a certain amount of productivity to the landscape itself. If you don't have beavers, you can do what are called BDAs, beaver dam analogs. A lot of the folks in the West and the upper Midwest have really been doing a lot with engineered beaver dams, if you will, basically creating wetlands by the same mechanisms that a beaver would have employed. The good part of that is you can control where the water goes and what trees are cut down and repairing and that kind of thing. There's also a process called zero order restoration. We don't have time to go into it, but that's the process where you go back to very first principles and working together with geomorphology and engineers and ecologists, you basically design water conveyances from the standpoint of going back to very first principles. There are a couple of these underway. There's one in Western North Carolina in the upper reaches of the Chattooga River on Forest Service area, the channel, the stream. There was a wetland that was made into a stream ostensibly for brook trout because the water was cold. Now they're going back and trying to restore that to a wetland in a zero order sense, going in the reverse. Instead of making a stream, they're making a wetland. Same kind of thing is going on the Cherokee National Forest in eastern Tennessee. And I know that if you want to, you can get involved with these kinds of things, if for no other reason to go out and see exactly what's going on and how it's done. Very interdisciplinary. There's room in there for people, historians, engineers, ecologists. It's both a very frightening time, but it's also a very exciting time, because almost no matter from what basic discipline you attack this from, there's a place and there's opportunities to do a lot of good.
I'm going to try to answer what Tyler says there, as well as have a take home here. And I think it's a good question. I appreciate you bringing that back up. But I think a lot of these things are human related problems, and more I've been in this, longer I've been in this. Research is very important. But when I was going through my PhD period, a lot of times I would sit in a talk or read a paper and they'd say researchers should do this. And I mean, and managers should do this. So the research projects would talk about management. And so I think we need more application driven research. And I think to get at what he's saying there, yes, I think we need more government support, more grassroots support, these conservation groups. They're all great, but the public needs to get involved. If there's ideas of, say, alternative stable states of our system that we need to be exploring, how that plays into some of our decision making or different techniques. Managers should do this rather than ending your paper with that. Try to do something, and I think that's the key here. Let's figure out what's doable. So you're talking to folks that, you know, we work in the management world a lot. And researchers do come up with great ideas, but make it application driven. And I think, Tyler, there isn't enough government involvement on the actual, like what is practical, research driven management. And I think there needs to be.
Great. And we're a few minutes after 3 o'clock. So I think in light of the time, we'll wrap up. But I really want to thank the three of you for participating in this. There's obviously a lot to mention and discuss. So thank you for sharing your thoughts with this group. And thank you to the audience for your participation, especially to those of you who spoke up to pose questions. Oranges, if you're still online, are there any closing statements you might want to make? Okay, well, with that said, thank you, everyone. We're going to close out today and enjoy the rest of your weeks. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for being there.
Thank you.
Thank you all.